I simulated over 1 million Pokemon battles by pitting every Generation 1 Pokemon against every major trainer in Red and Blue. We then calculated their performances to scientifically rank each one from worst to best, and today we're going to be looking at that list. And so before we can get to the number 1 spot, we're going to start at the very bottom of our list with Ditto, who we have scientifically determined to be the worst Pokemon in Generation 1. This is probably no surprise, as I'm sure anyone who's ever used Ditto before knows just how awful it is. Like, this placement just makes intuitive sense even before I explain how our simulation actually works. It's in the second lowest spot where things get a little confusing, as of the 83 evolution lines ranked, the legendary bird Moltres takes 82. Now, from the outside, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, so before we can start climbing towards that juicy number 1 spot, I'm going to explain our ranking criteria, which is basically just that this video is determining a Pokemon's total usefulness throughout a playthrough of Red and Blue. We're asking, of the 8 gym leaders, Elite Four, and 3 different champion battles, how many fights does this Pokemon actually help you in? And in the case of Moltres, that number is actually quite low due to its late availability. Moltres is locked all the way in Victory Road, so it's the last Pokemon available before you beat the game. So it's not that Moltres is strictly bad, it's that Moltres is bad in the context of a playthrough because it doesn't provide a lot of opportunities to help you. And I totally get it if you're still not sold, so I'm going to use a basic example to make it make a little more sense. I want you to think about your 8-year-old self who set off on their first journey to become a Pokemon master. In Red and Blue, I was always a Squirtle enjoyer, and I have very fond memories of Blastoise leading my team to championhood. Now, after beating the game and going on to catch Mewtwo, I definitely had fun going back to sweep the Elite Four. But despite that, there's no world where I would say that Mewtwo did a good job of helping me beat the game, because Mewtwo wasn't there to help me beat it at all. Mewtwo was off chilling in a cave contributing nothing, whereas Squirtle was the one taking hits and helping me get the wins. We're not saying that Mewtwo is bad, this video is simply trying to determine what Pokemon helps you beat the highest number of opponent Pokemon across the course of a game. Not only does this mean for our ranking that you should definitely not catch a Ditto, it means that Moltres is also not a very reliable option either. The same could be said for Tangela, who's taking the 3rd lowest spot. Tangela is available after you beat Koga and get Surfed, so it's not super late, but it is super bad. You can see here in its performance chart that running Tangela is just going to give you a really bad time. The same can be said for 4th lowest Hitmonlee, who only misses the first 3 gyms, but then goes on to deliver an absolutely pathetic performance throughout the rest of the game. And this can be explained simply due to its horrible Learnset. Unlike Machamp, who you'll later see scored much higher because it had access to Earthquake and Rock Slide, Hitmonlee actually has to use fighting moves to get wins, which are terrible in Gen 1. Next at 79, the 5th worst ranked Pokemon was Magnemite, who has a later game encounter and suffers from only learning electric and normal moves. And this sadly won't be a one-off case, so if you're an electric enjoyer, you may want to brace yourself for what's to come. Now next up, 78 sees Farfetch'd as the 6th worst Pokemon, which I gotta say I find really funny because there is a whole community of people who would stake their lives on Farfetch'd to be some underrated god. But no, it turns out the meme Pokemon is in fact just that. So the game's 7th worst Pokemon is Ponyta, who, like Magnemite, suffers from a late encounter and has no diverse moves or impressive stats to make up for it. And similarly located, Magmar then takes the 8th lowest spot, which is then very sadly followed by Scyther. Now, despite its great stats, Scyther's laughably shallow Learnset meant all it was capable of doing was landing high damage crit slashes, while its bug flying type meant it got stomped by pretty much every trainer left in the game. And then finally, capping out our 10th lowest, we actually see a tie between Muck and Weezing. Despite having different stat spreads and Learnsets, these 2 poison types performed the exact same after being picked up in the Pokemon Mansion. But this part of the list really just scratches the surface, and as we climb towards that number 1 spot, we're going to see even more shocking results. And in order for the gravity of these results to really make sense, we're going to dive a bit deeper into the specifics of the simulation process. And we'll do this by taking a look at our 11th worst ranked Pokemon, which I need to pour one out for as it is sadly Aerodactyl. So as you now know, the simulation process begins by seeing which fights Aerodactyl is available for. And because Kanto can be played non-linearly, we based availability in terms of a relatively time-conscious and sane player. Situations where you're just jumping ahead 2 routes to grab a Pokemon for a gym were fine, but doing crazy skips like fighting Erica as the 7th gym leader were not considered. And yeah, you heard me right, it is possible to fight Erica as the 7th gym leader. Now, since Aerodactyl was acquired on Cinnabar, we had its available fights include Blaine, Giovanni, the Elite Four, and Champion Blue's 3 different battles. The next step was to pit Aerodactyl against these trainers' Pokemon individually. So, for example, we would first have each member of Lorelei's team square up against Aerodactyl in a 1v1. We would then run battles with every combination of Aerodactyl's level up moves and TMs that were available in that point in the game, as long as they had at least one damage dealing move. This process was repeated for every moveset until Aerodactyl was able to get a win or all movesets were tested. Aerodactyl would do this against each one of Lorelei's team members, and the first part of its score would then be calculated. Now, in Lorelei 1v1s, Aerodactyl beat Dugong, Cloyster, Jinx, and Lapras, but lost to Slowbro, which would give it 4 wins out of 5. But there was one last simulation where Aerodactyl would be scored on, and that would be testing for the sweep. After running the 5 1v1s, Aerodactyl would then fight Lorelei's full team, just like how it plays in the actual game, now looking for an optimal Learnset that beats her flat out. After these results were recorded, it would then be these 6 simulations all weighted equally that would determine Aerodactyl's score out of 1. Now, in this case, Aerodactyl beat 4 of 5 Pokemon individually and could not sweep, so it got 4 out of 6, which works out to a final score of 0.66 for Lorelei. And I just need to make a note that this was done for every single Pokemon against every single major trainer in the game. Like the Charmander, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle lines alone saw 8,649 sets of moves. So really all I'm asking is that you just show the team some love for all the hard work on this one. Now, to give you another example, we'll look at Brock's single available point, who only has 3 simulations being scored. Brock's point was divided on results from a 1v1 against Geodude, a 1v1 against Onix, and his actual full fight. The results saw Butterfree, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur being the only 3 Pokemon able to sweep Brock, yielding perfect scores of 1. Now, Charmander was able to just beat Geodude, so that 1 out of 3 converted to a Brock score of 0.33, or 1/3. And as for the rest of the early game Pokemon, they couldn't beat Geodude or Onix, so they all received 0s. So for Aerodactyl, you give it 0 for the first 6 fights it's not available in, and then total the scores it got from every other fight. You then divide that total score by the 15 fights we evaluated it on to get what is a performance score of 0.527. And what the score effectively means is of the 53 gym leaders in Indigo Plateau Pokemon, Aerodactyl helps you against 52.7% of the game. For context, Moltres helps you against 41.6% of opponents, Ditto helps you in 15.8% of the game's fights, whereas the number 1 ranked Pokemon helps you against 88.7% of the whole game. And there's one more really important detail I need to iron out before we start working our way up there. You may have noticed that this system tends to weight sweeps more in the early part of the game. Brock gives you 0.33, where sweeping Lorelei only gives you 0.16. The reason we did it like this is that as the game goes on and enemy team size starts to grow, we didn't want Pokemon to be penalized so much for not being able to sweep. This weights it so Pokemon that provide help in the most amount of situations are favored. But on the other hand, it does slightly undervalue a Pokemon that can sweep a team of 6. The reality is there's no perfect way to do it, but we went with this route because it seemed most important to prioritize consistency and reliability. And so now that you finally understand the weight that this list holds, I think it's time we start moving towards that number 1 spot. At number 71, we see Voltorb immediately followed by the legendary bird Zapdos. We then have Kabutops followed by Electabuzz. At 76, we have Lord Helix followed by Pinsir, and then finally the game's first early Pokemon appears with the Weedle line. And one surprising upset here was that Beedrill actually received a score of 0 against Misty, despite its bug type having super effectiveness over Starmie. Next was Doduo, followed by the final and best performing legendary bird, Articuno. Articuno succeeded over Zapdos' similar availability, mainly due to Ice having a more favorable matchup in the endgame. Articuno was one of 32 Pokemon to sweep Giovanni, one of 11 Pokemon that swept Lance, and only one of 6 that swept Blue's Blastoise team. At 62, we see Venonat, then Seal, and finally Hitmonchan, who, due to simply having a more diverse Learnset, managed to provide more overall use than Hitmonlee's shallow set. 59 then sees Krabby, followed by Pikachu, who is the second worst performing Pokemon that can be caught before Brock. From here, it's Lickitung, Goldeen, Flareon, Lapras, Caterpie, Horsey, Chansey, and then Jolteon at 50. And while Flareon's low ranking is probably no surprise, I gotta say I was shocked to see how bad Jolteon actually performs. Jolteon was able to sweep Sabrina, Lorelei, and Agatha, but was held back by unfavorable matchups against Erica, Lance, and especially Giovanni. I think we all expected a lot more from Jolteon, and this is especially surprising when you consider that Vaporeon is ranking much higher. From here we see Zubat, Onix, Cubone, Pidgey, Execute, followed by Tentacool and Jinx. And at 42 we then have Porygon pulling a surprisingly high placement given its stats. And this one really came down to its Learnset giving it amazing coverage. Now next is Poliwag, then Meowth, Kangaskhan, Rhyhorn, Vulpix, and finally Machoke. And I actually do need to note there that I said Machoke, not Machamp, as given the rarity and access to trade evolution Pokemon, some players will not acquire the line's final members. Now this normally always leads to debates on whether you should count final trade evolutions, so we just decided to actually rank both. You'll see Machamp higher up on the list, and this placement is the performance of Machoke alone for players that have no friends. 35 is then Oddish, followed by Shelder, Snorlax, Spearow, and finally Tauros at 31, who is the highest ranking Safari Zone exclusive. 30 then sees Psyduck, followed by Staryu, Slowpoke, and then the evolved traded Machamp. And it's kind of funny because ranking right after it is actually Graveler without its final evolution. Growlithe then takes 25, followed by, and I'm really sorry to say this one, Bulbasaur. That's right. The Pokemon touted as the greatest starter of Generation 1 actually provides the least overall benefit over a playthrough. And when you consider that people tend to weigh Bulbasaur's early game quite heavily, you can see why this starts to make sense. Looking at its chart, we can see a great early game with a clear downward trend in its overall performance. And then at 23, we finally see the placement of the top performing Eevee line, Vaporeon. While Vaporeon's bulk helped it out a lot, the biggest reason it did so good here is that water types are just amazing in Generation 1. Water basically gives you a free stomp against the last two gyms, and most water types can also learn an ice move, which really helps against Lance. And actually, speaking of Lance, after 22 with Haunter, we actually see the Dragonite line. Now, with actually quite early availability and decent mid-game performance, Dragonite did a lot better than I expected. Most notably, it's the only Pokemon to not just sweep all three versions of Blue's champion fight, but actually sweep the entire Elite Four. Now, it is also important to note that this is a really optimal scenario for Dragonite. Given that it's a level 55 evolution, most players won't be running a Dragonite by the time they reach Lorelei, and so it's a lot more likely that players are going to still be running Dragonair as they head into the Elite Four. Now, hilariously, the next spot on our list actually goes to Parasect, who was able to secure consistently decent scores with its 100% accurate Spore in a generation where sleep is utterly broken. Number 19 then sees Gengar, followed by Mr. Mime, both being outclassed by Kadabra. We then see the absolute Mad Lad Raticate securing spot 16. With Dig and Stab normal moves, this thing was able to provide very solid consistency even in the endgame, where Pokemon like Bulbasaur actually fell off. At 15, we then have Mankey, followed by Ekans, Diglett, Drowsy, and Golem securing spot number 11. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the 10 Pokemon that provide the most amount of benefit throughout a playthrough of Pokemon Red and Blue. Number 10 is Jigglypuff, followed by Bellsprout, and then Sandshrew at number 8. 7 sees Clefairy, followed by the huge upset of Nidoking at 6, and then Nidoqueen at number 5. Number 4 sees the Charmander line. 3 is Alakazam. Number 2 goes to Squirtle, and the Pokemon that provides the most amount of benefit through a playthrough of Red and Blue is Gyarados. All right, let's just be honest here. You knew there was going to be more to this video than just that, didn't you? There's still a ton of time left in this video, and it's possible that you, like myself, are just feeling a little bit unsatisfied with that conclusion. So while this was a valid ranking and scientific result, as we finished up this portion of the ranking, I was just left with a feeling of needing more. Like, it felt like what we had just looked at was only half of the picture. Like, sure, the results of Alakazam, Gyarados, Nidoking, and Blastoise at the top all do line up in my brain, but there are some other Pokemon that just don't really fit there. Saying that Sandslash provides the 8th most overall benefit to a playthrough is different from saying that Sandslash is the 8th strongest Pokemon. That isn't to say that its contribution isn't noticed, but looking at just half of this only gives you half the picture. And if we want to get the full picture, we're gonna have to look at the other side of that coin. Let's dive a little deeper, shall we? Now, because Mewtwo is caught in the post-game of Red and Blue, it didn't even show up on this list. But to make an example, let's imagine that Mewtwo could be caught after Lieutenant Surge. You beat the Sparky Commander, and Mewtwo flies down and says, "Wow, I am impressed. I would like you, a genius 10-year-old strategist, to be my new master and use me for the rest of the game." Now, in this 10-year-old fever dream, Mewtwo would still score 0 points in the first 3 gyms. But from here, it would go on a rampage of destruction, receiving perfect scores for sweeping every single fight left in the game. And to any player, a performance like this would make it easily stand out as the best Pokemon in the game. But with the ranking system we used, Mewtwo would just score a 76.9%, placing it at number 13. And the problem with using just this style of ranking system is that there's actually 2 ways to achieve a good score. The first is to be like Raticate and do a pretty good job throughout a full playthrough. The problem is that a 77% across the whole game feels a whole lot different than a 77% that's achieved from sweeping every single fight you're available for. So the availability approach is a valid way to grade Pokemon, but I'm now going to provide you the second set of calculations we've run. This time, rather than judging a Pokemon over its total benefit, we're going to calculate average scores for only the fights they become available. This means that if a Pokemon doesn't have the opportunity to fight in a gym, it doesn't get a 0. And so while that means Pokemon like the starters and Nidoking won't have their scores changed at all, Pokemon like Moltres, who only get the Indigo Plateau to shine in, will only be evaluated for those fights. And so rather than looking at overall benefit, instead, this list will show how powerful a Pokemon performs for the time that you have it. In other words, how it actually feels in terms of play, power, and dominance. And so starting off at our lowest spot, and probably unsurprising to no one, we once again have Ditto. Dude, like, it is so bad. This win rate of 21.5% is still pathetic when compared to even the next spot up, who is no longer Moltres, but now Weedle. The next place then sees Farfetch'd, followed by Hitmonlee, with Pikachu capping the bottom 5 and Caterpie taking 6. These are Pokemon that are all genuinely very useful in the early game, but their late game performance falls off quite a bit. These Pokemon almost have the previous rankings problem, but in reverse. Rather than early game availability holding them back, it's their late game performances. Now from here we have another horrible score from Scyther, followed by Pidgey, Tangela, Pinsir, Sparrow, Zubat, Magnemite, and wait for it, are you ready? Venusaur. That's right, the game's iconic starter, without its great early game to support it, is now placing all the way down at number 70. 69 is then Oddish, followed by Hitmonchan and Doduo, who I'm surprised to see did bad in both rankings. Now Dodrio is quite strong, but it suffers from being a one-and-done Pokemon, meaning it was often good at taking on a Pokemon or two, but it just couldn't find sweeps anywhere. We then have Rattata, who sees a 50 place overall fall. From here, it's Venomoth, Flareon, Graveler, Meowth, Paris, Voltorb, Electabuzz, Kadabra, Jolteon, Ekans, Onix, Cubone, Krabby, Golem, and then Nidoking sees 51. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, just as I said in my own personal top 10, Nidoking is slightly overrated due to its bad late game. Now 50 sees Jigglypuff take a 40 place drop, followed by Ponyta, Nidoqueen, and then the Charizard line. This again feels pretty spot on to me. Charizard is nice in the late game, but its early game definitely holds it back. 46 sees Porygon, then Lickitung, Goldeen, Bellsprout, Seal, Machoke, Vulpix, Magmar, Sandshrew, Mr. Mime, Coughing, Grimer, Mankey, Horsey, Aerodactyl, Chansey, and then Squirtle at 30. Now Squirtle is seeing a 27 place drop, but don't let that seem like it's bad. Like if we just take a look at its chart to see its raw fight performance data, you can see that this is a Pokemon providing an incredibly high value throughout most of the game. So stand proud, Squirtle. You are strong. Now from here we have some familiar faces in Diglett and Clefairy, followed by Moltres, Drowsy, Zapdos, Kabutops, Almastar, Machamp, Arcanine, and Exeggutor at 20. Tentacruel then takes 19, followed by Jinx, Vaporeon, and Haunter at 16. Which is cool to see because it tells us that like if you're running a base game of Pokemon Red or Blue, you can use Haunter without its trait evolution and still get a lot of value. Almost as much value as Alakazam, who takes the very next spot. And I find this a bit shocking because people tend to rank Alakazam as being the most dominant Pokemon throughout the entire game. Even though it gains points in this ranking system, it actually falls in the overall ranking. And that's because others gained many more points from removing their early game battles. Now at number 14, we see a big jump for Dragonite, followed by a very stellar performance from Best Bird, third Articuno. And shockingly, it's actually Poliwrath that ranks next. Clocking great scores across the board with its diverse learn set, Poliwrath has no bad fights as its hypnosis makes it able to 1v1 every opponent it matches up against. Like, that's literally what this chart is saying. Poliwrath wasn't able to sweep, but it can literally take out any Pokemon you match it up against. Now, Kangaskhan then sees a massive glow up, followed by Rhydon at number 10. At number 9, we then actually have Gengar outperforming Alakazam. With access to Hypnosis, Dream Eater, Psychic, Mega Drain, and Thunderbolt, it's no surprise that Gengar did so good. 8th then sees Lapras, followed by Shellder, showing how good water types with ice coverage are in this generation. Interestingly, is number 6 goes to Snorlax, immediately followed by Tauros at 5. Now, this next one was one of the biggest surprises to me, as 4 actually goes to Golduck. Turns out the duck can do something that would get this video demonetized. This didn't make sense to me until I realized the duck learns Surf, Blizzard, Dig, and Submission, and then when you also remember it has Mono Water as defensive typing, you realize what consistency this Pokemon actually brings. Now, at number 3, and probably most impressive of all, we have Gyarados, who only fell 2 spots in the ranking. And next up was the Pokemon that I actually said I thought was the best overall in my own ranking, which is Starmie. Comes a little bit later, but as expected and as experienced, it's just a dominant force of nature once you get it. But finally, as the 6th water Pokemon to secure a spot in the top 10, the most dominant Gen 1 Pokemon for when you have it is the Water Psychic Amnesia wielding Slowbro. But I'm gonna do the thing again where I tell you that that's not quite it. Because just like as it works out with total benefit, ranking a Pokemon for its fights only also gives an unfair advantage. And we can demonstrate the issue with this sort of ranking with a really simple example. Imagine if instead of joining you after Lieutenant Surge, Mewtwo flies down and joins your party right after you beat Lance. Mewtwo's like, I've seen the cards and I am sick of that cocky rival. I'm joining the team for a last-minute beatdown. In this case, Mewtwo would join your team, sweep blue, and then also end up with a 100% win rate. So after we ran these sets of calculations for pure in-game performance, we once again realized that this just isn't the full picture. And we came to the realization that really the only way to get the full picture of what is the best Pokemon for a playthrough in terms of both feel and total benefit is to combine these two lists into one. So we took the performance scores from each set of calculations and we averaged them together to give you one final score. And I really do mean that. This is the final list. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you, without further ado, this is the most accurate possible scientific ranking for the best Pokemon for a playthrough in Pokemon Red and Blue. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe because this video took like over 100 hours to make. I don't know, while you're at it, like maybe go donate to a food bank or something. Now, starting out at our 84th spot, missing out on the first 2 rankings, it is now apparent that no matter what way you look at it, it is absolutely certain that Mewtwo should rank at the very bottom of this list. Whereas the uncatchable Mew will go a step further, being undeserving of a rank at all. Now from here, as expected, Ditto is once again going to take the true bottom spot at 83, followed by Hitmonlee as the 2nd worst available Pokemon. Like, that to me is probably one of the most shocking things in this entire list. Because from here, it's a little more expected. You've got Farfetch'd, followed by Weedle, then Tangela, Scyther, Magnemite, Pinsir, and then Pikachu capping out the bottom 10. And now, given that I've probably taken up more of your time, we're gonna go through a lot of this list in a pretty rapid-fire order. At number 74, we have Butterfree, followed by Moltres, followed by Doduo, Pidgey, Venomoth, Hitmonchan, Ponyta, Voltorb, Electabuzz, Zubat, Magmar. The Sparrow line then ranks as the strongest normal flyer. Next, it's Coughing, Grimer, Flareon, Aerodactyl, Seal, Oddish, Zapdos, Omanyte, Kabuto, Krabby, Bulbasaur, Jolteon. At 51, Jolteon ranks as the highest electric type. And if you couldn't have guessed, electric as a whole was the worst performing type in the game, with water obviously being the strongest. From here we have Lickitung, Goldeen, Meowth, Articuno, Onix, Cubone, Geodude, Porygon, Rattata, Horsey, Chansey, Vulpix, Machop, Paris, who as the 2nd worst type overall is the highest ranking bug. Honestly, this is also one of my favorite rankings because people view Paris so bad. With its 3-4 times weaknesses, I'm so happy to see it get a little bit of recognition. Now from here we have Lapras, Abra, and then Jinx, who is the highest ranking ice type that doesn't have water as a secondary. Next is Execute, followed by Tentacool, and then Ekans, who is the highest ranking pure poison. At 30, we have Poliwag, followed by Golem, Jigglypuff, Kangaskhan, and Rhyhorn taking spot of highest ranking rock type. Machamp takes 25, followed by Mr. Mime, Snorlax, and Shellder taking the highest ranking ice type. Mankey then follows that up at 21, taking highest fighting type. At 20, we have Tauros, followed by Psyduck, and then Growlithe, who will take the awkward ranking of highest ranking non-starter fire type. Now, at 17, Bellsprout actually takes highest ranking grass type. 16 is then Diglett, followed by Sandshrew, who is the highest ranking pure ground. Vaporeon then takes 14, followed by Ghastly and Haunter at 13. This placement as the strongest unevolved Pokemon is even more impressive when you remember that it has no capable stab moves. Now at number 12, we have the game's pseudo-legendary Dragonite, then followed by an amazing placement of 11 for Hypno. And then finally capping out our number 10, it's my personal favorite, Starmie. Now number 9 sees Nidoking, followed by Nidoqueen. Now, given that I've hyped this ranking up so much, you're probably wondering why Nidoqueen actually beat the king. As expected, these two obviously had very similar scores, but because Nidoqueen takes a sweep over Sabrina and Giovanni, whereas Nidoking takes its 2 sweeps against Lance and Blue Venusaur. And so actually given the fact that they have the same number of sweeps, the only difference was that not hitting a sweep was weighted to be less punishing in the late game. To put it simply, they're very equal Pokemon, it's just that Nidoqueen is more consistent through the gyms, while Nidoking is better for the Elite Four. Now Charizard is actually up next, taking a very respectable 7th place, while Gengar at 6 supplants itself as the overall second best trade Evo, strongest ghost type, I guess, and also on a technicality strongest poison. I say it's a technicality because Gengar doesn't actually use its poison in a way that helps it, or a way that it identifies with. Poison exists on Gengar to nerf it, so really you should say it got to number 6 despite being poison type. Now next, Slowpoke secures spot number 5 as best non-mono psychic type. Another huge shock is the extremely early Clefable actually taking spot number 4 as the game's best overall normal type. Then, with its great early game and consistent performance through the end game, Blastoise takes 3rd as the top starter and best mono water type. Then Alakazam, with its even better late game performance and great availability, takes number 2 as best psychic. But there's one Pokemon that when designing, Game Freak was like, you know what? Life's not fair, and we're going to imbue that into this Pokemon. Because on Heaven and Earth, Gyarados alone claims the title of Honored One. Because with an incredible TM Learnset, legendary stats, availability before Misty, and the best type in the game, Magikarp and Gyarados take title of Best Water type, technically Best Flyer, and overall Best Generation 1 Pokemon. So there you go. You can now know what Pokemon to use in a 25-year-old game. Congrats. But for real, guys, thank you so much for making it all the way through. This was a very big one. We appreciate the love. We appreciate the support. The YouTube algorithm is now recommending you another video to watch, so go click that, and I will see you later. Much love and peace.